I'm curator for Oceania here at the National Museum of World Cultures. And I'm going to try and give a very short presentation on a project that we conducted together with lots of other people actually, but it's just a small part of a larger project. So the larger project is part of an Australian research council funded discovery project, which is entitled Globalization, Photography and Race, the Circulation and Return of Aboriginal Photos in Europe. So it explores historical collections, and there's two main parts actually to the project. One part is documenting the historical collections that are at the museum, the different museums. And the other part is returning particular parts or sharing particular parts of the collections with the relevant communities. So those are the partners. So the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, and Museum Volkenkunde in Leiden, because it was started up before the merger. So the photographs that I worked with are a small, well, quite a large set actually of photographs, 470 images that were made by an anthropologist, a Dutch anthropologist named Alexander Cornelis van der Leden. And he spent exactly a year in an Aboriginal community in Australia. So he spent 1 year in this Aboriginal community and made photographs. He collected objects as well, which are now in 3 museums: the Australian Museum in Sydney, the National Museum of Australia in Canberra, and the Museum Volkenkunde in Leiden. He made photographs, which are also here, and part of them are at Ayatsis in Canberra. And then he also made sound recordings, which are also spread in two places. So but I'm going to focus here on the photographs. Oh, it's still better. I'm going to focus on the photographs. The photographs were made in this small community, Numbulwar, which is marked in orange there, which is situated in Arnhem Land, which is in the northern part of the Northern Territory of Australia. And today, Numbulwar is still a remote community. There's about 400 people living there, and during the wet season, you can actually only reach it by airplane. So when I arrived there, actually people were waiting for me, and I was met by Ella Gea, who's a community, working at the community center, let's say. And she had appointed 3 women who were going to work with me. Actually, it turned out that one of the women, we quickly developed a really close relationship, and one of the women I worked with most was Jangu Nundribala, who you can see there in the photograph to the right. And the other 2 women I worked with, you can see them in the photograph on the left. So that was Faye Mangura and Leonie Murumun. So together we decided to set up an exhibition. So it was called the Van der Leden exhibition, which they had printed a paper just to put on the school door of the language lab. And so the exhibition, in that exhibition, we showed the images in 3 formats. So there was a slideshow showing in the language lab. There were also, there were also just images that I had printed out here and that we put up on a wall. And then there were also albums that people could just go through. So immediately, before setting up this exhibition, actually, we were confronted with the issue of who can actually access these images. In Australia, there are quite a few projects that have been dealing with this, but this is one of the most famous one, or the most well-known ones, and that's the Ara Eriticha project, where they have a whole digital database where people can access, depending, in different ways, can access digital material, so audio material, photographic material, and also just written material. So it was actually something I didn't know before going, was that there was a whole set of images that had restricted access. I discovered part of the restricted access at Ayatse's library and archive, where the images that were restricted were marked with these red, labels, and so I couldn't actually see the images. And then in the community, it was also decided that men were going to decide which images were restricted. And those images are images of ceremonies, of initiation, male initiation ceremonies. So those two men helped me decide which images should not be seen by the whole community. And so we kind of made up a system of covering up particular sheets in the albums, and also in the slideshow we took those images out. So here you can see an image of a man who's actually lifting up one of the papers that is covering up the images that are restricted for access. So it was clearly marked that this was an album where you had restricted images, and that men actually used these albums and really looked at them, and women really made sure that they stayed clear from those images. Another issue that came up is the issue of showing images of people who have passed away. It's kind of a common, something that you hear that occurs very regularly in Australia, is this kind of blanket statement saying that that images of people who have died shouldn't be shown. And I saw that this was probably the case in the past, in the 80s, where, for example, Victoria Burbank, even when she was writing about people who had passed away, didn't mention the names just because they had passed away. But here in this project, I found that this wasn't really an actual problem today, because people talked very freely about, for example, this boy who was now a man and who had just passed away very recently. Also, the issue of the relevancy of these images today. For a lot of the people in the community, it was a way of reconnecting the past to the present. And every time you saw images of, for example, this man, Madi Murungun, it was stressed by everyone that this man was a really important man because he chose where to establish the community. Because in 1952, the community became a sedentary community, and they were before kind of living in a semi-sedentary way, but together with another community, and they didn't really get along, so they decided to establish their own community. And he was a community leader, and he was so he was very important, and that was stressed time on time again. But we also had very kind of personal stories coming up. So also about the past, but also really connecting the past to the present. So this woman, for example, she was a nurse, and Jangwoo, the woman I worked with the most, stressed every time again that this woman had taught her how to do basic nursing, and she was really happy to see also this little what she called a hut, which was set up next to the airstrip, where people, if they needed some care and the doctor came in, they could have some private space to be looked at by a doctor. This was an image which really talked to the children, because they immediately recognized their school building in there. And that was also a way for them to make these images relevant actually to them today, because they saw something that they really recognized and that meant a lot to them today still. So, and this kind of characterizes the whole atmosphere of the exhibition that was set up. Leonie Murungun, she called out, "I can't stop looking at this picture." And people came 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. There were people who actually stopped me at 8 o'clock in the morning asking when the exhibition was going to open so they could come. And it was really a way of kind of reconnecting to their family, and also understanding the family links, the kinship links. So here are just a few images showing how people kind of relate to these images. Here as well, she came back 3 times. The first time she came by herself, the second time she came with her son, and then she came a 3rd time telling me that her father unfortunately couldn't come because he was still alive, but he was not feeling well enough to actually come. And so the older women really stressed again that the importance of these images, and also all the children of the community came to see the exhibition, and they were being told about the images by the older women. These images were also a way for people to kind of, what I call here, dusting off knowledge. So old knowledge, things of how to do particular things. And so because the images also included just aspects of daily life. And this is quite a nice example of this boy who was really kind of fascinated by the canoes he saw. And he was a keen fisherman. So, and he told me the story that one day he got stuck with his father on a boat because the motor broke down. And so they had to paddle like for 2 hours back to the shore. And so he said, like, if I could make a boat like this, I could just sail back, and then wouldn't need all the petrol and I wouldn't need to pay for it. So immediately the older women also gave him advice on how to connect with older men who still knew how to make these canoes. And this is just an example to show what we managed to do. So this was one of the images of young men who were living in one house all together. And so we managed to identify everyone. And also with the identification came a lot of the stories, of course. But here is, well, it's the end of my talk, but I just wanted to also ask a few kind of questions, actually, which come up with this kind of project. Because now we have these images which were made 50 years ago in Numbulwar. Then they were kind of dispersed across different museums. The images go back to Numbulwar. And so what we have now is kind of a very kind of scattered archive where the information connected to the images is really scattered. So some of the questions that came up during this project is who should be allowed to access the images? How can the images be made relevant today? What can the images teach us? And with us, I mean everyone, not just the museum people, but also the people in Numbulwar. How do we archive the knowledge created by sharing these images? And where do we archive this created knowledge? And I think the first point of the point of access is really important, because even though these images are now in Numbulwar, I know they still have very limited access because they are in the albums, which are kept in the kind of the head office of the community. And I know that most people will not access the computer, for example, which is in the school, because still that is quite a big barrier. If you don't get people to look at the images, which they find really important and are really enthusiastic about, this still constitutes a very big barrier to go through those official steps. So.